welcome once again to Ewtn's Bookmark. Our guest author, the one and only Father Brian Thomas Becket Mullady, OPSTD, and his book is Christian Social Order. As always, a pleasure to meet you, one of my favorite teachers of all time. Even from the days when I was watching Ewtn, I always found you to be incredibly enlightening and pithy in your approach to things. Here you got something on Christian social order. Is there even social order or Christian social order anymore?
Well, there should be, though. You know, we have to do our best to try to make a dent in the granite that surrounds our social difficulties. And I wrote the book partially because I think a lot of Catholics are very confused about our social teaching. And I find that the popes will make statements, and even people who claim to be devout Catholics come unglued when they don't realize that at least some of the things they're saying are things that the popes have said for 150 years.
Right.
But they have to be interpreted, and also they depend on some background. Actually, they presuppose a lot of philosophical knowledge, and also, of course, the relationship to the gospel and scripture. But there should be social order. Human beings are naturally social according to Aristotle. And then if there is social order, obviously one difficulty we have today is the relationship of the church to the state regarding sinful practices, all kinds of things like that. And to try to separate off what the proper relationship is can be quite daunting. Lots of people have had trouble doing it.
You say in the beginning, the solution to the nature of society has great importance for morals. And then you say, should law implement morality or not?
Right. Yes, of course. One of my favorite quotations is from The Man for All Seasons, where the Cardinal Wolsey, asked Thomas More why he objects to the desire to get the Pope to give a divorce to the king. And then he says, oh, a question of conscience, huh? And he says, yes. He says, how can you set your conscience above public policy? And Thomas More answers, when statesmen forsake their private conscience for the sake of their public duty, they lead their country on a short route to chaos. Now, I think lots of people, even people voting for politicians and people doing politics today, try to separate off what we do in society from law, and yet the whole reason law exists is the government is in society. Now, the real issue is what the ultimate origin of that law is.
Right.
Many people believe that it's us, that we can arbitrarily determine what's good and evil. Justice, well, if you were living in England in the 17th century, you'd say the king makes something to be just.
Right.
No, God makes something to be just, because he created us.
But the king was supposed to have a divine right of kings. I mean, he was in a sense supposed to be there.
Catholics don't believe in that exactly.
Right. But for England at that time, that would have been the way they would have seen it.
Yes, but even they had trouble because they had a revolution over it.
Right.
But the king should implement that justice by good laws. The parliament, the democracy, the president, whatever, should implement that justice in certain cases necessary for social peace by good laws. But those laws have to correspond to who we are as a thing.
But isn't the problem that in reading through your book, the problem is we don't know who we are anymore?
Well, why? Because for one thing, many people don't accept the existence of a spiritual soul.
Right.
And that's not only in pagan countries, but it's in Christian countries. Well, I think that's one of the cornerstones of the new evangelization. When you deny there's any kind of spirituality to man, how do you determine what the source of rights are? Pretty much it's whoever has power is the one who gives you rights.
People say, well, the rights come from the people. But, you know, I mean, democracy, I mean, so what if the most people think getting rid of the Jews is a good idea?
Exactly.
Suddenly that's okay?
Exactly.
Or abortion is okay?
Well, there's a Catholic and non-Catholic way, for example, to interpret government derives its just powers through the consent of the governed. The non-Catholic way of interpreting that is the consent of the governed gives all the power and the truth to the government, representing their will, and they arbitrarily determine it based on self-interest groups, you could say. The Catholic way to interpret that is that we have an objective existence as a person with a body and a soul. Because of our spiritual nature, there's something, as Vatican II says, untouchable about the human person. The government exists to make laws in certain, again, like I say, specific things, to encourage that to be recognized. The consent of the governed can determine what sort of government does that. Will it be a king? Will it be an aristocracy? Will it be a democracy? Or a combination of all three? And then who is going to be the king or the president?
Oligarchy, whatever.
Whatever. Who's going to do that?
You say that, right? Yeah.
They determine who does it. But once they take authority, then they do this in the name of God, who's the one that created us. And so God is the author of society, not human beings. And this was a huge debate in the 19th century.
Right. Well, are there any Christian countries, quote unquote, anymore who actually think that? It seems like maybe some Islamic countries have the idea that maybe God is, quote unquote, running their country.
Yes, except they don't think that we have a spiritual soul.
Right.
So theirs is absolute submission, and there's no natural rights. Remember, in Islam, there's no 10 Commandments, and there's no natural law. God is sort of arbitrary, and he's just up there deciding what he wants to do. So even there, it would be better, because they do, they're theocracies, though. You know, they want church and state to be united.
Well, it is together always.
That's what the caliphate is, you know.
Right.
Where with us, the church and state are united, but we still have the natural law and philosophy, Greek philosophy, etc., through reason, to show to us that we do have a spiritual nature, and that therefore the government has to respect certain things about us. And if they don't, then they're unjust, and we don't have to obey them, for instance.
Now, you say when a pope condemns unrestricted capitalism that is identified with socialism, even though other popes who were great opponents of socialism have taught the same thing. Democracy seems to have adopted the point of view that majority rule creates ethics with no nod made to objective human nature, which is what we were talking about before. And that's the thing we hear about a lot today, because at times you'll hear these things come out and people say, oh, is the Pope being a socialist? When, of course, as you point out, the popes were against Marxism.
Well, I wrote to one of the principal Catholic politicians in this country about 20 years ago who was in favor of abortion laws. I won't tell you who it is, because it was kind of a private correspondence. And in the middle of the correspondence, he said, there is no more natural law. The natural law means nothing. Well, if that's true, then might makes right. And in a democracy, then the majority determines, for example, who has a right to life. That there is a right to life that we recognize and promote. One of the things I quote in the book, right in this part, I think, is C.S. Lewis.
Right, exactly. Right.
Who has Satan say to a jeer and tempter on earth.
So that's from Screwtape.
Yeah, democracy is the word by which you must lead them through the nose. And that you have to teach them that it's not just a system of government, which it is, and a good one, but it's also a system of existence and truth. So the majority determines the truth of human nature, and they often do it by self-interest. George Washington, remember, was very much against political parties, and one of the reasons is because he thought it would lead to self-interest groups that would then only be interested in their own little world. Now, there's nothing wrong with political parties, and I think the loyal opposition is important, so be sure we're honest about what we think. I'm not really into this bipartisanship our country keeps trying to push, because there's a reason there's a loyal opposition. But still, I mean, there is something to be said for the fact that, remember, in the ancients, how did they determine the difference between a tyranny and a just government? It wasn't whether it was one man or few or many. A just government puts their common good before their private good, no matter who does the authority. Whereas in a tyranny, even if it's a majority of the people voting in democracy, put their private good before the common good.
Well, it's interesting, too, because we talk about that in the sense of democracy. You talk about the book. But, of course, one of the great things, first of all, we're in a representative government here rather than a pure democracy. But the idea is always, the concern is for the minorities, to protect the minorities from the majority. So even in this country, the idea that just because most people agree with it doesn't mean it's going to happen. So, but then it gets down to, well, then if that's not the decision point, then what is the decision point if there's no natural law?
Well, that's the whole problem. And that's why we need to point out to people that once we do away with that idea, then we're basically lost in competition for power. And again, whoever has the power determines the truth, and whoever has the power has to determine what they do according to the truth.
Right. Now you say,
at least in Christianity,
that this is a new compendium of Catholic teachings concerning society. You've chosen a systematic approach. In part one, I will examine the nature of society and theoretical principles of the social order. I'll then apply these to distinguish three basic human societies: the family, the state, and the church.
Right.
And in part two, I'll apply the theory to practice and enumerate a Catholic vision of how the most basic human societies, the family, the state, must pursue their goals.
Right.
Now, we live in a world today, especially, where out of that, the family's really taking it on the chin.
Oh, big time. One of the principles I have there is the most important principle in Catholic social teaching, really, which is the principle of subsidiarity. Mm-hmm. And it's a companion to another principle called organic growth. Mm-hmm. Small is beautiful in Catholicism. Mm-hmm. The basic building block of all social order is the family. Mm-hmm. And the principle of subsidiarity states that it's not right for a higher community to subsume the functions of a lower community. The purpose of the higher community is, if they do exercise authority, for example, the state, about economics or about the family, it's to encourage those on their own level mm-hmm. to do what they're supposed to do, right. Not to take them over where, the president is looked upon as the father, the mm-hmm. parent of the country. That's what happens to totalitarianism, mm-hmm. the parent, No, we have parents. It doesn't take a village to raise a child. Right. Parents are supposed to do that. Right. And to encourage the parents to do what they're supposed right. to do. So the idea would be that if the family is not healthy, if all the relationships aren't respected, if contraception, for example, attacks this, divorce attacks this, all kinds of things attack this, then that's where children right. primarily learn to lose their egos and develop selfless love. Right. Now, if that's not healthy, the state's not going to be healthy, even the church, right. because we depend upon family life right. as the primary cell of social development, because it's where everybody learns what it means to be social.
Of course, I remember growing up as a kid, and clearly your local neighbors took an interest in you.
Sure.
And that's in that village sense. Yeah. But clearly your parents were responsible for you, and in this village raising everybody, it really took about the mayor is in charge of is in charge of raising. Yes. It's not the village people, so to speak. It can be the village people. Yeah. But that whole idea of it being like, when they say that it takes a village, they're really saying, well, it's the government of the village is now responsible for raising the children.
Right. So we don't know how to be parents. We have to let the government be parents.
The experts. We live in the world of the expert.
Yeah.
Well, we have to check with the expert to make sure it's okay. Now, you say the church speaks about social matters in her competence to direct and guide the human person ethically. Now, there's a term sometimes you'll hear when certain things get said and people say, is that inside the church's competence?
Right.
What does that mean?
Well, one of the things I quote in the book is one of the statements of one of the popes, I think from the 19th century, who basically said techniques are not the church's competence. Okay. Like how to run a business. Obviously, most priests don't have a clue how to run a business. Mm-hmm. Some people do, but most don't. But the principles, the moral principles that should govern such a thing, like the fact that the workers owe a just day's work, and that the employer should pay a just day's wage, mm-hmm. and also provide a just product, and where profit motive wouldn't lead you to provide something inferior to mm-hmm. someone, especially something that might fail, right. like build a bridge for the cheapest possible price that will fall down while there are people on mm-hmm. it. Those kinds of principles are things we can point out to people. For example, who to vote for, it really, in my opinion, now I'm sure there are priests who would disagree with me about this, but you can't really tell a person who specifically to vote for. Mm-hmm. But you can lay out various platforms and what various people think, and analyze it based on what Christ teaches us. Mm-hmm. And of course, many people don't accept Christ in a society like the United States, which is a pluralistic religious society. But then you'd also have to do the natural law. Mm-hmm. What the natural law helps us to understand about these things from reason alone. Mm-hmm. Now, once you do that...
And there's also a hierarchy of truths in there, too, right. which sometimes gets distorted with the kind of, sometimes, the overuse of the seamless garment approach.
Right. Exactly. And we don't want to be like Muslim imams who run the state, the mm-hmm. bishops and the priests. It's true there was a time in Christian history where bishops were also political figures. They were lords. But that was partially because they were the only educated people in the society. It was like an accident. But we do want to be able to help people to develop their conscience. The 19th century basically held the people in the capitalistic liberal states of the 19th century that were secular basically held the priest should stay in his sacristy and mind his own business. Well, we're not like that. We do have a right to speak about the public forum, but not in a technique by saying, look, if you do this, it's going to destroy the family, it's going to destroy the state, it's going to create a lack of peace. It's basically going to lead to inhuman life for all of us.
And in many ways, the separation of church and state was designed to protect the church from the government, not to protect the government from the church. You say Catholic social teaching is also teleological. What does teleological mean?
Teleological is a fancy two-bit word, because this is sort of an academic book. I try to hit a line that might be acceptable to both academics and non-academics, but you know that is
think you hit it quite well.
Not easy to do. But it means that it's based on what the purpose is. The purpose, for example, of the family is procreation and education of children, friendship among the parties, and fidelity. In order to encourage those things, there's a certain order of male and female in relationship to childbearing, of husband and wife in relationship to each other. For example, the husband and wife, the traditional Catholic term, and I know this is controversial, is that, you know, the husband is the head of the wife, but it's not as master to slave. That's the way it was reduced after the original sin. It's wise governor to free citizen, and they each have their role to play as free human beings, each to contribute, and that has to be recognized and supported. If that were compromised, that would compromise their own relationship, it would compromise the children. It would also, in some sense, compromise their contribution to the economic order, and that would compromise the state. The state's purpose is primarily peace and justice in the public forum among the citizens. So it's not the state's business to educate people as such. They can provide an education, but to tell parents how to educate their children, parents have a natural right to pick what education they want. It's not normally the state's business to run businesses. Now, they may make certain laws about business, like child labor, for instance, or working hours or something like that, because that has to do with the general peace of the society. The state does have a defense thing and that sort of thing, but it's not, it also has no competence, for example, when it comes to the church. Just recently on the news, apparently this mayor of Houston was ordering all the pastors to give her their sermons. Well, she had to go back on that because the pastors, for one thing, they objected, and they have rights.
Of course.
That she can't violate.
But I mean, you know what's scary is that that would even come up.
I agree.
I mean, because 25 years ago, no one would have even thought that somebody would have the hubris to do that.
That's right. Well, but you know, in England, that's what happened in the Protestant Reformation. I mean, again, that movie Man for All Seasons has the great line in it where Thomas More is finally condemned to death, and they ask him if he has anything to say, and he says, the indictment is based on a law which is directly contrary to the law of God and His holy church, the supreme power of which no temporal person may by any law presume to take upon himself. This was guaranteed to St. Peter and his successors while Christ was present and personally present on earth. And more than that, the immunity of the church is promised in the Magna Carta, a civil document, and the king's own coronation oath. And as a result, it's insufficient in law to charge any Christian to obey it. You know, when he's tried, they ask him, do you recognize the successors of Queen Anne and Henry as legitimate heirs to the throne? He says, Parliament tells me they are. I recognize it because the state has a right to determine who's going to take power. And he says, but what about the preamble to the act that says the marriage isn't valid and the Pope has no power in this? And he won't answer.
Right.
You know, because they don't have a right to say in Christian marriage who has the right to determine who's marriage and who isn't.
Right.
And then, of course, the church's final perspective is heaven. And as a result, another big difficulty many people have, and I address that in the book, is they have a tendency to compare authority in the church, because issues about authority are determined by this final goal.
Yeah, you talk about that a lot, actually, because it is all about authority.
Yeah. They want to say that authority in the state should be the same as authority in the church and vice versa. Well, the state has its role, it has its purpose, And democracy, oligarchy, or monarchy, or a combination of all those might be fine for that. But that's not what the church is. The church is about divine, supernatural, transcendent life. After all, its fullness is a society seen in the communion of saints.
So how can you vote for the truth?
Well, that would be true in the state too, but especially the theological truth.
Right,
yeah.
right.
But you remember we had these groups, common consensus, common core, something they wanted to determine things by democratic vote. Well, you know, it's true there's a thing called the sense of the faithful.
Right.
But you know, the sense of the faithful includes everybody that's always been in the church for the last 2,000 years.
Right.
So if they've thought something was absolutely
So the church
true,
triumphant has to be part of that equation.
yeah, and we couldn't decide today that this would be the sense of the faithful if it contradicted what people have believed for 2,000 years in our church.
But that's not what people think. It just means that if a bunch of us disagree, then that's okay because that's our
That's
sense.
right. And if we could
The
just
question is, are they faithful? That's the question.
well, yeah.
To begin with.
Well, if they can influence power enough, they can get doctrine to change and contradict itself.
Well, we see that in many other denominations
true.
where that's happened. You say the real greatness of man lies in his immortal spiritual soul by which he can have a special relationship with God. And isn't that really what it's all about? Because again, you get down to who's the authority and what makes man special.
Right.
Okay, because if it's not God, then who's the authority? If man isn't special, then why does he have to be treated any different than any other creature?
Right. Well, again, the origin of authority is a very interesting question because many people believed, Christians, that we needed authority because we were sinners. Others believed that authority because they thought we could create the state totally. This is called the social contract theory. And it was Hobbes and Rousseau who invented it, basically. That we just give people authority, we can take it away like that for no reason, right? Well, look, any human society, if you're going to have a number of people who have free will getting together to do something, they have to have direction. There has to be one person deputed to speak for the group. I use the example of rowing a boat on a very superficial level. Everybody gets out and gets in the boat. Okay, everybody row the way you want, how you want, etc. Well, everybody's going to conflict. They're not going to go anywhere. So they say, okay, you call the time. Okay, we may vote on where we want to go, but then we won't change. You implement the direction,
right?
You know, and so in some sense, every authority now, of course, this is clearer and more immediate and deeper in some, like you said, the hierarchy than others. But in some sense, every human authority is a reflection of God's authority governing the world. But not because it's X, Y, or Z who's doing it. It's because of the power of the common good, which reflects our souls, which reflects realizing virtue in us.
Right. But in talking about the common good, sometimes the use of the term the collective, or the idea of the common good gets misused into this totalitarian approach where you as an individual aren't ultimately important because what's really important is the greater.
Right. Well, there are certain things about ourselves that we can't realize alone, like justice. In justice, you will give another person. If there's no other person, you can't implement justice. So the common good recognizes that there are some things about myself to realize about myself where I need to be a part of this greater good. It's not just my private interest, but on some level is a deeper implementation of the truth and my desire for good than I could have all by myself. And so the common good is not the sum total of the private goods of the citizens who vote on it. It's an objective experience on a deeper level of what we are as people that we couldn't attain if just left to ourselves. And it includes both the purpose and the order to attain that, and you can't play off one against the other, and because it's about a human being, both have to be moral. So if you have only order...
But who decides what's moral?
Well, again, it would have to be the objective nature of the natural law. If all you have is the order, but it's for the sake of evil, then you have things like Nazism. It was an extremely ordered society. All the Germans loved it because they had been in chaos before economically, et cetera, but it had evil implications. If all you have is a good purpose, but a crummy order, then you've got chaos. You're never going to, bring the thing about. So both have to be good and both have to be human,
Well, you say here the root of freedom is in the will, but the cause of that freedom is in the intellect. That's a quote used. Thus, the person is both qualified and obliged to take responsibility for his actions. I know we're running out of time, but isn't that one of the great problems we have today, that no one wants to take responsibility for any of their actions?
Absolutely.
Right? It's always somebody else's fault.
Oh, victimhood, yes.
Right.
One of my favorite cartoons is the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon with the toy tiger, where he says, "Nothing I do is my own fault. I'm a victim of forces that are beyond my control." And then Hobbes says, one of us needs to go stick his head in a bucket of ice water. And Calvin says, "I love the culture of victimhood." And what I also find weird is, everybody's a victim, but nobody's a predator. Now, it's illogical,
right?
But nobody. I have the impression a lot of people don't think about this stuff anymore. They just react. So I wrote the book to try to help people to think about this.
How long did it take you to write? Because we're just about out of time.
The book took about. Well, I taught a class in this, and I already had notes from it from many years ago. It took me about 8 months or 9 months to write.
Well, thank you so much for putting it in print for us and stopping by Bookmark.
Thank
Always
you
great
for
to see you,
having me.
Father.
Yes.
It's Father Brian Thomas Beckett Mullady, OP. His book is Christian Social Order. It's available through the Ewtn Religious Catalog. Go to our website, ewtnrc.com. You can order it there. Thank you for joining us. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.